Hey everyone, this is Rob here from Collegio. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to check out their React course. And this is going to be the first of the companion videos to go with the lessons. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering an introduction to React, how we can set up our environment, and once we have our environment set up, we're going to look into how we can actually use JSX to print out some HTML to our screen. So with each lesson, we have a starting point. So today you can get your code from github.com/react_lesson_1_skeleton, and that'll take you to the code base page where you can either clone or download it. If you don't have a GitHub account, you can just click on the download button, click download zip, and it'll download the zip folder directly to your downloads. If you have a Mac, or you can specify on your Windows machine, and then unzip your file, and that'll be where we can get started. So like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about React in the next several lessons, and primarily we're going to be talking about using React to display elements to the DOM. So brief introduction to React. It's a JavaScript framework. It was developed and maintained by Facebook, and it's a front-end library. So there are some back-end solutions that are being developed, but right for the purposes of this course, we'll be using it as a front-end library for building our user interfaces. So what makes React different from a lot of other frameworks? React uses a component-based architecture, which is great for modularizing your entire program. You can take your blocks of code and you can separate them out so that you're not repeating yourself, which is the main thing. You don't want to repeat yourself when you're writing code because it introduces more chance for error. If you have to make an update on one piece of code, then you have to go and make the update on the other corresponding piece of code. And that's just with two. If you have several times where code is repeated, it can turn into a real nightmare. So React is actually used to drive a lot of major applications out there. A couple of the companies that use it currently are Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, and Salesforce. I know it's also used with Evernote a bit as well. So it's getting a lot of traction out there, and it's always good to be ahead of the curve when you're learning programming languages. So why would we use React? Well, due to the widespread adoption of React, it's looking like it's projected to be driving apps for a long time coming. There's a large community out there that's helping with any errors you may encounter. Also a lot of libraries and packages, so you don't have to rewrite your any tedious code, such as say a date picker or something like that. And once you get used to using it as a web framework, you can then easily use it for building out on things such as mobile or VR. There are libraries available for that as well. It's just JavaScript, so you won't necessarily be working with an HTML file and a bunch of other different languages. Everything is strictly written in JavaScript with React. So, as mentioned, React adopts a component-based architecture. We're going to be talking a lot about the component-based architecture in the next lesson, but just know that component-based architectures do not like repetition, so we're going to look into how we can create unique components in the next lesson. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about React, let's look into the software that we're going to need to go through the first several lessons of this course. So of course the first thing you're going to need is going to be a text editor of some sort. I use Visual Studio Code. I've particularly enjoyed it lately. It's actually fairly new for me to work with, but I encourage you to work with it as well. I used to use Sublime, which is also a very good option, but I like Visual Studio Code because it just gives me a few more features that Sublime, that my installation of Sublime didn't offer. If you're using something like Atom or WebStorm or something, that's fine too. Just know that your colors on your variables and stuff may look a little different. In addition to this, we also need a command line tool. So if you're using Windows, that's going to be the command prompt, CMD. I'm using a Mac for this lesson, so I'm going to be using iTerm2. Terminal is fine as well if you're on a Mac, but I like to install iTerm2 because it lets me do a couple of extra things on there, primarily copy and paste, which can get really annoying when you're trying to copy and paste variables and you can't in the regular terminal with ease. So in addition to these, let's look into what we're actually going to have to download to use as well to work with our project. So the first thing you're going to need in order to work with React is going to be Node.js. So Node.js is located at nodejs.org. And if you go to nodejs.org, you will get the ability to download Node.js. So I'm on a Mac, so I would use 9.90, the current. You click on that, you'll see the package will download below. Once you actually get the package, you can download it, and then you'll have Node.js downloaded and ready to go. In order to verify that, you can actually go into your terminal, and you can click node-v. And if it says node command not found, that means it's not available. So let's install and see what it'll say when it is available. Okay, so once you have node.js installed, you can actually check the version number on the command line and verify that it's actually installed by typing in node -v. What that'll do is that will give you the version number. You can see it's 9.9, just like what we downloaded on the nodejs.org download screen. In addition to Node, the main reason why you're actually getting it is because it also downloads the Node package manager onto your computer. And you can actually see that by typing npm-v. So what the Node package manager is it's a way for you to easily install third-party packages into your project. So it's able to be used via command line. And not only is it easy to install packages, it's easy to tell other anybody else using your project what packages you're using as well. So if you, for instance, if it's on a GitHub repository, you don't have to actually put a copy of all of those third-party packages on there and have the other person download them, which could potentially be gigabytes. So this way, a package.json file is created, which actually tells anybody which third-party packages are used in that project, so they can easily download them from the source once they get it downloaded. So we'll see how we'll be using this soon. Just know that we downloaded Node because we needed npm. So in addition to this, we need one more package manager. And the other package manager we're going to be using is Yarn. So Yarn is actually located at yarnpkg.com. And if we go there, you can see there is a getting started link, and if we go there, there's an installation button, and we can download it for Mac, which is what we're looking for. So in order to actually download it for Mac, you may need to also install Homebrew. It feels kind of odd, like you're downloading a package manager to download another package manager, but this is actually something that's unavoidable. So there would be different instructions if you're actually getting it for Windows. So follow the applicable instructions. It's fairly easy either way, and make sure that you have Yarn downloaded onto your computer before you get started. So we're going to install it using Homebrew. So if you go to if we go to our command line and type brew install yarn, we'll see that Homebrew is actually not located on our system, so we're going to need to download that as well. So if we search for Homebrew, you'll see right here, it's the first thing you'll find, brew.sh, and then you can just copy this command, go into your terminal, paste it, and it should take care of it for you. So if you click enter, you're going to need to enter your actual login password for your computer on the Mac, and then it'll take a moment to download everything for Homebrew, and we can try rerunning it to download Yarn onto our system. Okay, so now that Homebrew is installed, let's attempt to install Yarn again. So brew install Yarn, and then we'll click enter, and we'll wait for that to finish downloading. Okay, now with Yarn installed, we have all of our package managers ready to go. So let's now use npm and download some of the first packages that we're going to be working with. So the first thing that you're going to need to have in order to run your React project is going to be a web server of some sort. I would use Live Server, which is what I'll be using for the rest of this lesson, and it's super easy to download, super easy to use, and it just has a couple of cool features like live updates. So let's actually download it here using npm. So if you go npm install -G live-server, you'll actually download live server onto your system. So let's talk about this for one moment, because this is the first time we're going to see package manager's install command. So we're using npm, as you can tell by the npm, and we're installing a package. So the command to do that is npm install. You're going to see that with yarn, it's actually yarn add. It's not yarn install, but that'll come in a later time. We use the -G flag, and what the -G flag is it signifies that this is a global install. So what this means is that we don't have to install live server again for every new project. Typically, when you install a third-party package, it only installs in the project folder you're currently in. But in this case, we're going to be using live server for some future projects as well. So you might as well go ahead and install it globally. So let's go ahead and do that. And once that completes, we'll see how we can use live server, and it's super easy. So, oh, look, it appears that I actually can't install this, and the reason why is due to an access error. So if you ever see EACCES, it just means that you don't have the proper permissions. So the way to go around that on a Mac, obviously, is to use sudo, and I'm just going to use sudo double exclamation point, and that just runs sudo on my previous command. So I'm going to enter my password and wait for that to download again, and this time it should install without an issue. Okay, so now that you have your web server downloaded, let's talk about the remaining packages that we're going to be using with our project. So the first two we'll talk about is the React package and the React DOM packages. So these obviously are going to be used to define our React components and turn them into elements that'll be used on your web page. So for our projects, we'll be using the CDN links for these. Don't worry, you don't have to get them. They're included in the skeleton code provided with this video. And just know that React is what we're going to use to load our core React framework and define things such as our components, whereas React DOM is what we're actually going to use to take those components and turn them into the web browser. You can kind of see there how we can use this for also deploying to VR and mobile as well, because it'll be the same core framework, you're just changing the React DOM with something else. But more on that once we get to React Native. So like I said, the CDN links, you're already going to have those available in the code base. You can actually see them in the skeleton code under the public folder in index.html, and you'll see those there before an actual script app.js file. So let's talk about this file for a moment while we're here, because this is probably not going to change for quite some time, so we might as well chat about it now and then it's out of the way. So anyone who's worked with HTML can see this is a basic HTML page. It contains a head section, which contains your character set along with the title. Our project is going to be the free agent tracker. We're going to use it so that potential free agents in a sport can list their name, their gender, and a quick note about themselves. So in addition to that, there's a body here which has one div that has an ID app. We'll talk more on this later, but this is basically where your entire code base is going to end up getting deployed to. And then we see our three scripts below. So there's the React script, there's the React DOM script, and there's our scripts app.js, which is located under the scripts folder here. And we'll talk more on this later, but this is actually a generated file and we won't ever be changing anything in there manually. So let's go back and talk about a couple of the other packages that we're going to be using. In addition to React and the React DOM, we're also going to be using Babel. So Babel is located babel.js. And if we search that, you can see it's located at babeljs.io. Now what Babel.js is it's a JavaScript transpiler. So what that's going to do is it's going to take all of our React code and it's going to actually change it into the stuff that's readable by the browser. So a lot of people are moving to using newer versions of JavaScript now, primarily JSX functions, or not JSX, my apologies, ES6 functions, which is, we'll be getting into that soon. But not all browsers currently have support for ES6 and ES7. So what Babel does is it bridges that gap so that even though your browser won't support the newest programming language, the newest versions of the JavaScript programming language, you can still program in them, and it kind of downward compiles it so it'll work with ES6. Usually it's a lot more code to downward compile, so it's good to let something like Babel take care of that for you. So just know that we'll be using that to actually change our React code into regular ES 2015. So you can actually, if you want to play around with it, you can try it out. We'll go back to trying it out at a later point, but for now, let's just leave that open there so we can work on it later. So also, not in this lesson, but in lesson 3, we're going to introduce Webpack. And Webpack is a module bundler, so more or less we're going to be building a simple program in the first 2 lessons, and then we're going to add a level of complexity to it once we hit lesson 3. Once it gets to that level of complexity, we need a way to identify all of our React packages and have them actually transpile into something that we can use. So this is where we're going to be using Webpack to do this, and do a couple of other things as well, such as actually generate CSS from a Sass file as well. So for the time being, know that we are going to eventually use Webpack, but it's not going to be covered in this lesson or the next, and we're going to get ample coverage of it in lesson 3 and use it from that point moving forward. So once you actually have the source code downloaded, you can go into your project folder and you can open up your source/app.js file, and you'll see that there's a little bit of skeleton code in here already, but not an awful lot. So if you're used to working with JavaScript, but not necessarily ES6, you may not be familiar with some of the code you're seeing right now. So in addition to this video, I've also recorded a video on some of the ES6 functionality we're going to be using, but I'll give a quick overview of what it is right here. So the first thing you're going to notice is right here what's known as an arrow function. So this is basically the exact same as typing out something like function form did submit dot prevent default. That's pretty well the same syntax. It's just arrow functions have a couple of extra features to them that aren't available in standard functions, and if you want a little more information on that, you can check out the corresponding ES6 video, and I provide a couple of examples there of exactly the changes and give a very good outline, so I would suggest checking that out. In addition, you might see that there's a const variable there, and that's something that's new to ES6 as well. So actually, in addition to const, we're also going to be using let. So we can do something like let variable equals 0, and we're going to be using that all of the time in place of var. But basically know that const is a constant variable, which means that once you declare it, you have to specify a value, and then that value does not change. And let is used to declare a standard variable. But there's a couple of subtle differences with let and const from a regular variable. If you want to check those out, once again, I'd suggest checking out the companion video to this on ES6 functions. So now that we've got that underway, let's try and output our first piece of JSX code to the browser. Okay, so let's try and actually print some HTML out to our screen. So in order to do this with React, we're going to use what's known as JSX. So what JSX is, it stands for JavaScript XML, and it's known as a language extension. So it's actually an extension onto the JavaScript language. It looks kind of like HTML, but it's really JavaScript, and it's what we're going to use to actually render the HTML inside of our applications. So we'll be using it plenty throughout the course to develop our applications, and let's take a look at why we're going to use this over standard HTML. So let's create our first JSX variable, and before we do that, I'm just going to comment out all of this code, and we'll come back to this later. But for now, let's declare our first, a very simple variable that will display an h1 tag to the screen. So we'll start with let, and we'll put let template equal H1. We'll just type hey there, and we'll put a semicolon. And that's our first line of JSX. So a few things you'll notice is that JSX doesn't have any quotes around it, but it has a semicolon at the end. It's just the HTML tags. So another thing that can be done if there's multiple tags and you want to put some line breaks in there is you can surround JSX with round brackets, and it does the same. So either way works, but for now we'll just keep it without its brackets. And once we have a piece of JSX, we can actually render that to the screen by using React DOM. So in order to do that, you would actually type React DOM with capital D, capital O, capital M, and that's .render. And once we have that function declared, there are two arguments. The first argument is going to be the JSX we want to render. In this case, it's going to be our template. So let's type template. And then the second argument is where we want to place that generated JSX. So in our case, in the index.html file, we see we have a div with ID of app, and that's actually where we want to send that to. So what we'll use is document dot get element by ID, and then in there we'll just enter app, we'll save, and now let's try and run this using live server and see what we get. So go into your main project folder. In my case, I'm on the desktop, and then once you're in your folder, you can type live-server and then public. So nothing is printing there. So there's a reason why nothing is actually printing there. And the reason why is because, as mentioned, we actually need to add Babel to our project in order to transpile our JSX into proper ES 2015. So there's actually a couple of steps we need to do in order to be able to do that. And the second is going to involve actually using npm to download another third-party package for the command line. In this case, we're going to be using the Babel CLI. So let's install that. I'm just going to use sudo right away because it's likely going to ask for it. npm install -g babel-cli. And once we do that, we'll see that it'll start downloading, and we'll be able to check that it's installed by typing babel space -- help. So now that it's downloaded, let's type babel -- help. And you'll see that we can actually see that Babel is available there. So now we're not done yet. So now that Babel's actually created, what we also need to do is we need to download some packages. But in this case, we're not going to download them we're not going to download them globally, but rather we're going to download them into our project folder. So let's go into our project. I just opened it up on my other screen here, so you can see it's at desktop React _lesson 1 skeleton master. So if we go there, cd desktop React lesson 1 skeleton master, and now we need to install our Babel packages, but in order to do that, we first need to initialize Yarn, because we used npm to download our global packages, but we'll be using Yarn to download these. So in order to download any Yarn packages into your project, you first need to initialize it with Yarn by typing yarn init. And once that's complete, it'll ask you for a bunch of information. You can just click enter to go through it, and it'll automatically create a Yarn file for you that will allow you to download new packages into it. Okay, so now that we have Yarn installed into our project, let's take a look at the presets that we're going to need in order to work with Babel. So we actually need two presets in order to work with Babel. We need the React preset and we need the env preset. But before we go further, let's talk about presets and what they actually are first. So if we go over into Babel and we click on Docs and then you click on Plugins here, you'll see below that there's a couple of presets. Now the official presets are env, React, and Flow, and what they do is that's what actually tells Babel what it's receiving in and what to actually change it to. In our case, what env will be doing is we'll be changing any ES6 code we have into ES 2015, and what the React or the React preset, sorry, will do is that will change our React components into ES 2015. So we actually need to install those into our project first in order to convert our code into ES 2015. Now we're going to do that using Yarn, obviously, since we just initialized it, and you can do that by typing in yarn add babel preset react and space after that, and then babel preset env, and that will actually install both packages instead of making us type yarn add twice for each one. So once that's done downloading, we'll take a look at where that actually goes. And it'll take a moment typically with any sort of package download from Yarn or NPM or anything like that, as you can tell already. And now once it's downloaded, it actually downloads the packages into node_modules folder. So you can see there's a whole bunch of Babel stuff that's actually was just downloaded, and to save us space, that's why we actually use a package manager, because you wouldn't want to be duplicating this code on anything you're storing out there in the cloud. You just want them to download it from their source, and then they would be guaranteed to be getting the newest version of it as well. So now that we actually have our presets downloaded, we can go in and use the command line to take our file or any of our files and change them into correct ES 2015. So just keep in mind we still have our test server going there using live-server, and now let's clear that out and we'll see what we actually type in order to make this conversion in Babel. So we'll start by typing Babel. And the first thing we need to do is actually specify what file our code lives in that we want to change. So in our case, that's in the source directory, and it's app.js. And now what we need to declare next is where that code is going. So that's going to be --out-file, and we'll put a space, and where we want the code to go is in our public folder, in scripts folder inside of that, and that's going to be in app.js. Remember, that's the file that we actually reference inside of our index.html. And finally, what we need to do, or we also need to install the we also need to specify which presets we're using. We've already installed them. So in order to do that, we would go --presets, and that's going to equal env, not even, comma, react. And then finally, in order to make this easy and not have to run it every time, we'll just use --watch. So once we do that, if we click enter and we don't see any errors there, we know that our Babel is actually converting our project into JavaScript. So let's go over and see what we've got in our browser now. So if we actually go over, you can see that hey there is actually printing, and remember that is the piece of JSX that we just wrote. So if we change that, hey there you, and we save it, and we go back over into our browser, you can see it's automatically changing. So that's why we're using live servers, so that we can just get that automatic change. So any code we're going to be creating in the next two lessons is going to live in our src/app.js file. So just know that moving forward. Now, a few quick things before we begin. Like I mentioned, we're going to be using Git and GitHub for a lot of this course. If you're not using GitHub already, I'd suggest saving any projects to some sort of repository, such as GitHub, Bitbucket, something along those lines, because you never want to have your code in just one place on one computer, because if something ever happens to it, you're never going to see it again. And this provides that extra level of security. So once again, we talked about ES6 and ES7. Although this isn't an ES6 or an ES7 course, we are going to need to know some basic ES6 and ES7 concepts. So you can check out anything that we'll be using in this course in the complimentary ES6 and ES7 video, where we'll quickly go through a couple of examples and show why we're using it. So anyways, let's get going and start working with some actual JSX. So what we're doing right now is not incredibly scalable. It's just a basic line of code there. You're usually going to want to set multiple tags inside of your code, and like we said, you can actually do that by using a bracket. If you take your bracket and put it on its own line, it tends to look a lot nicer at that point. So if we go hey there you, This is our first paragraph. Let's save this and let's see what actually happens. Once we go over into our project, you'll notice that it looks like it's broken. Now let's take a look at our inspector here and see if it says anything for us. And what it actually doesn't say anything at all, but we know why it's broken, and it's actually in the command line that says where it's broken here. And in the Babel command line, it says that there's an issue. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So what this actually means is whenever you declare any JSX, you can have multiple tags inside of it, but the one thing you need to know is that there has to be one large parent tag that encapsulates everything. So in our case, we'll set it up as a div. Usually it's going to be something along those lines, unless it's just one tag, in which case you actually make it the tag. And then now that that's set up, we'll go and check out our code. You can see the change happen without issue, and now it's actually printing, hey there you, this is our first paragraph. So just keep in mind that moving forward, you'll need to actually have one parent element that encloses the entire thing. So that's also known as a wrapper element. Okay, so our program is actually printing some JSX to the screen now. However, it's static at the moment, and we're not going to be able to really do an awful lot with a bunch of static HTML. So let's see how we can add a dynamic element to our JSX. So let's actually start by creating a new variable. So that new variable is going to be called my name, and we'll set that to my name, Rob. And now let's see how we can add it into our JSX below. So in order to inject something into your JSX, what you would use is curly bracket, and then you would place whatever your variable name is in there. So in our case, it's going to be my name, and you close it, oh, not my name, it's going to be my name, and you close it with a curly bracket. And if we save that, we'll add an exclamation point at the end and save again. And if you go over and check in the browser, you'll see that it's now adding my name. So this is how you would add variables value into your JSX. Instead of being the variable name, it's Rob. And we'll be using this moving forward for adding a lot of logic into our JSX. So in addition to that, we can also use expressions within this. So think of this as whatever you can do when you're initializing a string, you can also do in here. So let's get rid of our exclamation point, and we'll actually add it inside the string. You can use the plus to concatenate in JavaScript, and then we'll use our exclamation point. Save and move over. You can see there's no change there. There shouldn't be, but if we add the second exclamation point, that's actually there now. So this is how we'll be using JSX to inject some dynamic variables into our code moving forward. Now, in addition to this, just keep in mind that you can't add an object this way. So if we set up an object, let person equal, and then you have name, Rob, and we save that, and you can actually say person here. And if we go over, we'll see it kicks an error. So it just shows the object. What you actually need to do is use the name in there. So that's how we would set up and add dynamic variables into our JSX. So we're going to be using this an awful lot as we move forward. We're going to, at the end of this lesson, have created the first version of our free agent tracker, which has the ability to add, clear the list, and view all of the available free agents. But we'll be getting into that very soon. And now we're going to look at some conditions in JSX. So now that we know how to add some dynamic values into our JSX, let's see how we can also conditionally show some values inside of our JSX itself. So in addition, instead of this is our first paragraph, let's add a welcome message in here that's going to change depending on the user. So let's start by adding a skill level to the person. And that skill level, let's set it to be beginner. And then we'll create another function. And we'll call this function print welcome comment. And in this function, we'll pass in a level. And inside of that level, we'll have a condition so that prints a different line to our screen depending on what it is. So let's start with if level equals basic. We'll return, please remember to ask questions. However, if they're not a basic user, we'll return let's get started. So now that we have our function available there, you can see that if the level's basic, it's going to return please remember to ask questions, or else it's going to return let's get started. Let's add this down into our JSX here. So actually we'll get rid of this entirely because we're returning JSX here. As you can see, you can also return JSX into another piece of JSX. So the same as when we add our values up above, we'll use a curly bracket, and inside of here, what we'll do is we'll call print welcome comment, and we'll pass person dot skill level. And now with that passed, we'll save, and we'll take a look at our program output. And you can see it says let's get started. And why is that? So it might because I set my skill level to be beginner, where it has to actually be basic. So if we change that to basic, now you'll see it says please remember to ask questions. Once again, change it over to something like expert, and it'll just say let's get started. So that's how you would add a conditional statement inside of your JSX. So remember, you can't actually add it completely in here in most cases. If you're doing anything sophisticated, you're going to want to extract that out into its own function. In addition to using it this way as well, we can also set up what's known as a ternary condition. So for anyone who is not familiar with a ternary condition typically takes the format of bracket condition, and then there's a question mark, and then you have your true value, whatever it is it's going to return, or else you have your false value. And with a ternary operation, you need to include all three of these. So you need to have your condition, question mark, true value, colon, false value. So we can also do this inside of our JSX as well. So let's change up our actual welcome comment to do this instead. So instead of calling the function, we'll get rid of that. And what we'll do is we'll place our condition in here. So that's in brackets. So you're going to see person.skill level equals basic. And now if that condition is met, what we'll do is we'll return please remember to ask questions. Or else we'll return let's get started. We'll add an exclamation point because we're excited about this. And so if we save that and go over into our code, you can see let's get started is printed, and that is because I'm set to expert. But if I change that over to basic, it says please remember to ask questions. So the ternary operator is another way to actually set a condition in here. Ternary operators typically involve a lot less code writing than actually printing your if else statement. But the way I usually see it with something like this is it's an issue of complexity over readability. So I would code to the level that you feel you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with just using if else statements, that's fine. However, if you want to cut back on the actual amount of code in your files, you can go ahead and use ternary operators. So now that we're talking about that, we'll actually talk about one more condition that we can use to print something in JSX. And that is the AND operator. So remember that a variable, if you just pass that into a condition, it returns true unless it's null, a blank string, false, 0, or undefined. So we can use this to our advantage when actually conditionally printing one string. So what I want to do is, if the user is a basic user, I just want to print please remember to ask questions, and if they're not, I don't want to print anything. So let's get rid of the let's get started at the end here, and we'll see how we can change this up to actually do this and conditionally check if the user skill level is basic, and then print the JSX if it is. So let's get rid of our brackets around this. And so you have person skill level equals basic, get rid of our question mark and put and. And what that means now is person skill level equals basic. If that is correct, then it's going to print please remember to ask questions, because this is always true. It means that if this is true, both will evaluate and then this will print to the screen. So if this is not the case, nothing's going to print to the screen. So now that we saved it, let's see what it outputs to the screen. And you can see it now says, please remember to ask questions, because my skill level set to basic once again. So we'll set it back to expert, we'll save, we'll go back, and you can see that there's no string there now. So that's another one of these ways to quickly conditionally show a string if you need to. So just remember that these are at your disposal. You can also use functions to do this as well. Once again, readability versus actual code complexity. And now that we know how to actually perform a bunch of dynamic operations inside of our JSX, let's talk about how we can actually set up attributes inside of our JSX itself. So anybody who's used HTML knows that it's typically not just the tag itself. You include a lot of common elements inside of your tags. Some of them are such as an ID, so the header, or you can use a class, or you can use, say, a bunch of event functions such as onClick, onUpdate, things like that. These are all available inside of your tags, but just know that there are some, due to the nature of JavaScript, that you can't use. The most important of these to think about is class. So class is actually a designated keyword in JavaScript, and even though this looks like HTML, remember this is JavaScript at the end of the day. So in order to actually specify a class for your tags, you're going to need to use class name instead of class. So you would set that up by using class name with a capital N. You would open your brackets, and then you could type my class in there. And what that will do is that will actually set the class of this H1 tag to be my class. Now you notice that class name actually has an uppercase N to it. This is by design, and if you don't have the uppercase N, it is going to kick back an error. This is also the case with just about anything else that is a combined name inside of JavaScript. So if you consider like autofocus would hold a capital F, onClick would have a capital C, onUpdate would have a capital U, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind, and in order to actually see the list of these, you can go to react.org/docs/dom-elements.html. And that will give you a list of all of your different attributes down below. So down at the bottom, you can see a list of all of the attributes supported by React, and any of the SVG attributes as well, although these are primarily the ones that you're going to be interested in. Now the final thing we need to cover in order to add dynamic values into our JSX before checking out the project itself is arrays in JSX. So you can directly inject an array inside of JSX, but in order to do it, you're going to need to use an ES6 function. That function is called map, and we're going to cover just how map works before we move on. So map is actually used on an array. So let's create an array here called, we'll let test array equal to 2, 4, 6, 8. And we'll have another array, we'll call it let mapped test array. And we're going to make that equal to something here, but we're going to use map to actually create our mapped test array. Now what map is it's an ES6 function that's applied to an array that returns an array with each element inside of the original array would have some sort of function performed on it. So what we're going to do in this example here is we'll see how we can use map to actually double each number inside of the array. And now inside of our map test array here, what we want to do is we want to call the map function on test array. And now inside of the map function, what we're going to supply is an arrow function. So once again, arrow functions are covered in the ES6 video for anybody who needs a refresher. And so that arrow function is going to have round bracket, arrow, curly brackets with something being performed inside of the curly brackets. So if we, inside of the map function, what we're going to pass as an argument into our function itself is a specific item. So let's just call that array item. And so what that's going to be is it's going to go through each of these elements, 2, 4, 6, 8, and it's going to pass it into this array item, and then we're going to perform something on it, and that's going to become that element of the map test array. So in our case, we want to double it. So what we want to do is we want to return array item times 2. And once that array item is returned doubled, what we can see is the result. So let's console log each of these. And now we'll console log the mapped one. And save this. And now if we go over into our resulting program here and we inspect, we're going to see here that the original is 2, 4, 6, 8, whereas the mapped array is 4, 8, 12, 16. So that's a quick crash course on how map works, and we're going to be using it to actually print an array of JSX out to our page. So let's start by actually creating an array in here. So let JSX array equal, and so each of these forms of JSX, we're going to make it a list item, because what we're going to do is we're going to print a list here. So the first list item will say 1, second list item will say 2, third list item will say 3, and we'll just use 3 for the time being. And so what we can do now is within this array, we'll print it out to our screen. So we'll keep this the conditional there, and now we'll just create an unordered list. And then inside of that unordered list, we'll add our curly brackets, and now we're just going to run a map command to actually print everything out that's inside of the array. So in order to do that, we would go JSX array dot map, and then inside of that map there is an arrow function. That arrow function is going to take JSX item, we'll call it, and what it's going to do is it's just going to return that JSX item. And we need our curly brackets there, which is why it's kicking back the issue. And we will save that. And if we go and see our output now, you can see that 1, 2, and 3 are showing, but we're getting an error over here that says each child in an array or iterator should have the unique key prop. The reason why it's saying that is because when you're iterating through an item like that and printing the same JSX over and over again, what happens is if you change one of those, React is smart enough to know specifically which one you changed and just update that view for the user. That saves a ton on resources. In order to do that, it needs to actually have a key specified with it, so that's why it's kicking up that specific issue. Let's make a quick change to this code so that we can actually specify this with a key. So let's get rid of any of the surrounding JSX here, and we're just going to change these into strings for the time being. And now if we do that, and we'll get rid of these closing tags. Now if we just create these as strings, and instead of returning just our JSX item itself, we actually return a list item like this with a key. That will actually do the same as what we had just seen. So if we go back over and see our output, you can see 1, 2, and 3 are there. We're still having this issue, and in order to get rid of that now, it's much easier. Instead of doing it 3 times, we only do it once. We add our key attribute in here, and we'll just make that JSX item as well, because we know that it's not being repeated in there. But typically, if you're pulling data from a database, this is just going to be the row ID or something along those lines, just something that's unique to the piece of data itself. So now we go back over, you can see 1, 2, and 3 are printing, and there's nothing actually showing as an error, so that's very good. Now we actually have some working JSX here. We have it showing something conditionally. Remember, we're not a beginner anymore, but if we change that to basic, we'll see it. We have it conditionally showing a string, and we're showing an array of items here. So this is actually a pretty good start to our JSX, but it's lacking one element. that element that it's actually lacking is the ability to have some sort of user input. So with any program, you know, there will typically be forms where you add some text to fields. You can actually click a submit button and then something happens. This is also the same case in React. We can do this as well in JSX. So we'll look at how we can do that. So let's add a button into our code now. So if we go over into our view and we add a button, we can just type click me for the time being because we're not going to be doing an awful lot with this code. That button now is available to have an event added to it. So remember, any events and attributes are typically in camel case. So in our case, we're going to want to set up on click. And in this, let's actually set up a function. So let's just call it right here, and then we'll declare it above. So let's just call that button click. And then above here, we'll declare the function button click, and that's going to have nothing attached to it. And so let's actually alert something out to the user in this case. So alert button is clicked. So now we can save that, go back over into our code and see if it actually works. So we see the click me button is there, and if we click it, you can see that button is clicked. So that's perfect. We now know we have a working button with an event, and that's as easy as it is in React. Is you add the on click, you set your function up to click, and then you actually can use it there as much as you would like. So one thing you may notice is that I don't have the round brackets here, and there's a reason for that, and that's because if you actually place the round brackets there, it's not using the variable as a click event. It's actually just calling that button click once. So if we actually did that, it would, and we go back, you see that button is clicked there, but it's not going to click anymore afterwards. And that's the reason why. When you're adding an event or when you're adding a function to an event, you don't need to specify the brackets because you're adding the variable. You're not actually calling it right then and there. So those are really the main things that we're going to need in order to set up our initial project. So if you're not sure of some of the concepts, we're going to be really using them in practice here for the rest of the video. However, if you need to work on them any further, there's also, you can check out the companion slides to this lecture itself, which outlines everything we talked about here, and it also has a references section at the back, which will actually give you a bunch of good resources as well. So without any further ado, let's actually go ahead and get started with creating the free agent tracker. So let's get started with actually creating our free agent tracker. So the first thing that we're going to do is let's get rid of all of this old code that we just created here. We're not going to need it moving forward, and let's uncomment out the skeleton code so we can begin working with it. So just a quick overview of what we have going on here is we have a form did submit function. Now what that form did submit function does is that will be used to add a new free agent into the system. This will be the last thing we actually work on, so we'll just put that aside for the time being. We have a clear all players function, and now what that clear all players function will do is that will be used to completely clear out the list of players now when a list is actually created. So the final one we're looking at down there is render view. What that's going to be used to do is actually render out a view to the user. So we're setting this up as a function in itself because we actually can't dynamically render the view at this moment. We're going to be using React to do that eventually, and right now we're just using JSX. So that's the reason why we're setting up a render view function, and that's where we're actually going to get started here. So in order to get the render view function created, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to create a template. So let's set that up as a constant for the time being because we are never going to change this template once it's declared here. And so we're const template equals, and we'll add some round brackets here so that we know it's JSX. And inside of that JSX, we'll start with a div. Inside of that div, we'll begin with our header and our subheader. So H1, free agent tracker, and then an H2 that says get active after work. So if we save that, and then we render the function using React DOM, we should see something printed to our screen. So React DOM dot render, the first argument is going to be template. The second argument is going to be document dot get element by ID, and remember that's going to be our div with the ID of app. And so now, if we save and go and review our what's output, you can see the free agent tracker and get active after work is actually showing. So this is a good first step right here. And now let's look at what we need to do next. So we actually can't tell if we have any players in there yet, and there's not going to be any players until we actually add one in. So now let's look at how we can use events to actually add a new player into our system. Let's start by declaring the form itself. So we're just going to go inside of our main template here, and we're going to create a new form. That form is going to have an onSubmit function, or an onSubmit attribute that's going to be a function. And remember, that's going to be form did submit, which we said we were going to use for adding new users to the system. And so now we have our form set up, and we need to add some actual items so we can submit the form itself. So let's start out. We're going to add a name. Input type equals text. The name is going to equal my name, and we're not going to give that any value right now. We're just going to but we're going to add a placeholder to it. So the placeholder is going to equal your name. We'll add gender as well. We're just going to set that up as an input element for the time being. This should be a select element, but it doesn't really matter at the moment. Name equals gender. Placeholder equals gender. The reason why we're just setting it up as a text is because in the next lesson we're actually going to be setting up our component using React, and then we'll make the form much nicer. But for now, the focus is just on how does this functionality actually work. Input, finally we'll add a third one that's text, and we're going to let that be the comment. Name is going to equal comment, and placeholder will equal your comments. Finally, add a submit button. So you can see it's kicking back some issues here because we've got some red squiggly lines. There's actually, the reason why is because JSX is actually looking at this more from the traditional XML standpoint. And in XML, when you have self-contained tags, they have to contain a / at the end of them. You may have seen this in the past with breakpoints that were developed places, which have br/, but you just know that you need that for your JSX. Moving forward, finally, we'll add this one here onto our input, and if we take a look at our view, you can see now it doesn't look pretty, but we can actually add some data in there. We can see if our submit function works. Let's actually pretty this up and add a breakpoint in here so that we can get a little bit of separation. Actually, we'll add 2 so there's a little bit more separation. And then we'll set this form did submit function up to actually alert that the form did submit. And let's see if this will actually work. So we have our onSubmit function. Whenever we click submit, it should trigger this form did submit. e.prevent_default is what we're using to prevent it from actually reloading the screen and submitting up to the server. So let's see if this actually works now. So we can click on our name. We'll just enter anything in here. And now if we click submit, you can see form did submit. So we're partway there now. We've got our form submitting, but we're not actually working with our data just yet. So that's where this passed in E comes into place. All of our data is going to live inside of this passed argument here. It's not just used to prevent the default behavior. So let's go ahead and let's actually pull out the name, gender, and comments now, and let's add it into an array of our possible free agents, which we are going to need to create, but we'll do that once we pull everything out. So let's start with const the name, and that's going to equal e.target dot elements dot my name dot value. Now what this is this is actually the name of the element, so because we're getting the name, it's called my name, and when we get the gender and comment, as you'll see, it'll be comment instead of my name. So let's just copy this line so we don't have to retype everything out again, and we'll change this to the gender, and that's going to equal e.target.elements.gender.value, and finally we'll create another constant down here, and that's going to be called the comment, and that's going to be equal to e.target.elements.comment.value. So now that we have those, we could output them if we wanted to, but let's first create them as an object so we can add this up. So finally we'll use const the player equals curly bracket, and we'll have a name attribute, that is the name. We'll have a gender attribute, which is the gender. And we'll have a comment attribute, which is the comment. And finally, once that's done, we can actually console log it out, and we'll see what this is actually showing to us. So now that that is done, let's head over and try it out. So we have here that our form did submit. Why is that? Okay, I thought that happened automatically, but I guess I didn't wait for that. So we have my name, we'll put Rob, we have the gender, we'll put male, and we have comments, I like to play baseball. And then if we submit this, what we're seeing over here is we actually have our comment, our gender, and our name in the correct places. So now we're ready to actually add this up into our list of free agents here. So let's start out, we'll create a global function up top, or sorry, a global array up top. That array will say let free agents equal square brackets. So now free agents is empty. So instead of actually console logging this out, let's just use free underscore agents dot push the player. And now we'll console log out our free agents, and we'll see how this works out. So, free agent. So that needs to be free agents. So let's add our first user in there. We'll put some dummy data in. You can see that it's showing the user there. Let's add some more in. And we'll add some more different dummy data. And we'll submit that. And you can see now that we have an array with 2 elements in there. Perfect. So now that we actually have our players being shown, what we need to do is we need to be able to output them to the screen. Let's see exactly how we can go about doing that. So if we go back over into our code, now we know we have our list of players here. Let's get rid of our console log, and all of this should be fine for the time being. And we'll go down into our code, and we're just going to add them in as a bunch of their own separate div tags so that we can actually see each specific user. So let's type in here. We'll also add a horizontal line to kind of separate it out from everything else. So let's start by adding our horizontal lines. And now inside of your 2 lines here, let's create our list of free agents. So we'll start out with another H2 tag, and we'll type free agent list. And now remember, we use the map function to print out arrays of elements. So in our case, free agents is an actual array itself. So we can use map to actually print out everything we need here. And let's see how we can actually go about doing that. So we'll start with our curly brackets, and we'll go with free agents.map. And now inside of the map function, we are going to pass it in the player. We'll give it the same name as the variable we used above. And inside of that, what we want to do is we're going to want to return some JSX here. So let's return some JSX, and inside of there we'll encapsulate our specific piece of JSX inside of a div itself. So now that that's there, we'll actually print out our individual players' information. So what we'll do is we'll start out with an H3 here instead of an H1. We'll progressively move downwards, and then we'll inject that player's name, the player.name, H3, not H2. And then we'll add a paragraph here that says gender. And inside of gender, we'll inject the actual value, the player.gender. And finally, we'll add the comment in. and that will be comment, the player.comment. And now that should be enough to actually return our JSX to the actual program itself. So let's go back and we'll take a look and we'll see what happens here. So you see it has a free agent list, nobody's there. So we'll add our first member in, submit, 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 but I'm not actually seeing any users. So remember when I said that React is going to take care of all of the rendering for us. That is the case, but like I said, we're not using React just yet. We're using JSX. So we actually need to tell the screen to re-render everything, and that's super easy. But once we push our new player, we'll just call render view, just like we did in our last line of the code, and that'll automatically re-render the view. So let's give it a try one more time. So we'll actually enter some real data in here. So Rob, gender is male, comments is this is a comment, and if we click submit, you can see that Rob, male, this is a comment, but I'm having an issue with the key prop as is expected because we're going to be repeating a bunch of stuff. So let's add a key in here and then we'll try it one more time. So div key equals, and we'll just make that equal to the player's name. I know it's not a good case to use this in the real world, but for our testing purposes, we'll just set them to be the name. And now let's add Rob once again. Oh, we'll add Rib instead. We'll say I like ball. And then we'll actually add Rob this time. So Rob is male, and I don't like ball. We'll click submit. And as you can see, we can keep adding new users. So if you add Jane, female, some sort of comment, you can see that these items now keep adding to the list. So what we've done is we've actually created the ability to list all of our free agents, and we have the ability to add our free agents. And finally, before we finish up, we just need one last function, which is the ability to actually clear all players from the list. Let's go ahead and let's set that up right now. So you can see we already have our clear players function up here. So all we really need to do to actually clear out the players is get rid of all of the objects inside of the free agents list. So that's actually really easy. We can just say free underscore agents equals a blank array, and then we just re-render the view as we had to do up above. And that should be it for the most part. So now that we have the clear players functionality set up, we just need to connect it up to the front end in our JSX. So let's put that right above our horizontal line here so we know it's sitting right above, and we'll have another button. That button is going to have an on-click function, and the on-click function of that button is going to be clear all players. So type clear all, so we're clear on exactly what the button does. And if we save, go back and check out our free agent tracker. Remember, we're not saving anything, so we're gonna have to add a user every time. So Rob, male, I like ball, we'll add that one. We'll just add a couple more. It's gonna give an issue because it's the same name. But now if we click the clear all button, that should get rid of our list in its entirety. We add another Rob, we can clear the list again. We add another Rob, we can clear the list yet again. So that just about does it. That gives us all of the basic functionality we need using just JSX alone. We haven't touched any React just yet, but it's important that you know what's going on in JSX moving forward, and that's why we did go through this exercise. So just to give a quick recap, JSX stands for JavaScript XML, and it's more or less the templating engine that we're going to use to output our HTML to the screen. One last thing we'll see before we leave is what it actually is once it's compiled, and I just didn't want to kind of put a bunch of gobbledygook code in your heads before we got started. So this is what we actually went through and developed, was these functions and this JSX, and what's actually used to output to the screen is something like this here. So you can see there's not many changes due to ES6, ES 2015, like it's using var instead of let or const, and you can see it's setting up as a function instead of as an arrow function. But But the main change is in our render view here. This is what our JSX is actually changing into, is this. A whole bunch of React.create element functions, and those all contain each of our little individual items. So that's really why Babel is so important, is because it takes this and it turns it into this. So in the next lesson, we're going to actually go over a component-based architecture in detail, and we're going to take a lot of this functionality that we just used, and we're going to actually set it up as React components themselves. So once again, if you need to access the code, you can access it at github.com/collegio/react_lesson_1_skeleton. And in addition, if you wanted to see the completed code that we just went over, you can also see that at github.com/collegio/intro_react_JSX. So thank you very much for watching this video, and we'll be back shortly with lesson 2 on components in the component-based architecture and creating our first React project.